The sky above King's Landing was heavy with ash and the lingering scent of smoke, as if the seven hells themselves had opened beneath the city and unleashed their choking breath upon its streets. Through the haze drifted the last embers of the blaze that had engulfed the Red Keep. Broken walls and shattered windows gaped like the mouths of dead men, and in every corner of the city, all heard the ravens calling. Rumor spread, rumor turned to legend, and by the time the truth was known, 1,000 whispers had already shaped the tale beyond recognition. Yet certain things were undeniable. King Robert Baratheon, the usurper as Targaryen loyalists named him, had led the rebellion to victory and claimed the seat of power. But in a single night of terrible revelation, he had set that seat, indeed the very symbol of Targaryen might, alight with dragonfire. The Iron Throne was gone, its twisted swords melted into slag, and from those molten remains came a decree that would change the face of Westeros forever. In the halls of the Red Keep, scorched tapestries flapped in the wind. The high ceilings seemed cavernous now that the throne room was devoid of its dread centerpiece. Robert stood at the far end, the flicker of torches dancing across his broad shoulders and thick, coal-black beard. He was a power of a man, barrel-chested and tall, though months of war had carved lines of weariness into his brow. Soot clung to his hands and cheeks, no matter how vigorously he tried to wipe them, a stark memory of what he'd done. His eyes, usually bright with wine and laughter, now carried only an exhausted determination. Around him, lords and knights, bannermen who had risked life and limb for the Baratheon cause, shifted in uneasy silence. No one spoke of the screeching that had rung through the corridors earlier that night, the cry of metal on metal when the king ordered the Iron Throne to be ripped apart. Some present had watched in horror, some in fascination, as the blacksmiths from Storm's End and the Crownlands hammered away at those ancient swords. Others whispered that the throne had seemed to resist the hammers, that an otherworldly shriek had filled the chamber, as though the souls of all the men who had once knelt before the Targaryen dragon rose up in protest. But Robert's will had been iron that night. The braziers roared with flame. Once the final blow was struck, the molten steel had run in rivulets across the marble floor, leaving patches of burnt stone and dark smoke that reeked of scorched iron. He did not share the reasons for this act at first, nor did he invite counsel. Yet the next morning, with the black remnants of that throne still cooling, he summoned his lords. All of them, from the highest in rank like Eddard Stark and Hoster Tully, to the lesser ones who had ridden beneath his banners, gathered in the ruined throne room. Ser Barristan Selmy arrived, injured and weary, to stand behind Robert, though no one knew what thoughts lurked behind the famous knight's quiet gaze. Varys the Spider was nowhere to be seen, though whispers said his little birds had flown out to gather tidings beyond the city's walls. Lord Tywin Lannister stood on the outskirts, golden hair shimmering even in the gloom. He observed with an inscrutable calm, his eyes glittering with the reflection of torchlight. The hush was such that when Robert finally cleared his throat, the sound reverberated across the high, empty walls like thunder. He spoke slowly, as though weighing the destiny of a continent with every syllable. Westeros was broken, he said. The rebellion had torn it apart, but the seeds of that fracture had been sown long before, with mad King Aerys and the arrogance that ran through Targaryen rule. Robert told them he wished to avoid becoming another tyranny, another seat of absolute power that would one day spark fresh rebellion. He had grown to hate the game played in King's Landing, the constant maneuverings and betrayals. The realm had bled for those games. He'd been a young lord once, brimming with romantic ideas of chivalry and war. But after the tragedies and losses, the murder of Elia Martell's children, the betrayal at the Trident, and the harrowing siege of Storm's End, he'd come to see that this forced unity strangled the Seven Kingdoms more than it united them. He had burned the Iron Throne, he said, so that no man would sit upon it again. Then he decreed that each of the Seven Kingdoms, Dorne, the Reach, the Westerlands, the North, the Vale, the Riverlands, and the Stormlands, would stand on its own, its ruler the master of his or her domain. Any man who wished to remain in King's Landing as part of a central council might do so, but there would be no single king to rule over all. They would form something of an alliance, a compact of peers, each responsible for his kingdom's well-being. They would join together in common causes, repelling invaders, ensuring trade routes remained safe, but they would govern themselves. He would remain a lord in the stormlands, no longer styling himself king of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. The Targaryen wheel of conquest that had bound them all under one throne was shattered. The silence that followed was palpable. Some thought him mad, for had he not just won the right to rule all Westeros? Others watched with guarded hope. Some lords, particularly from the north and Dorne, exchanged glances. It was not lost on them that centuries ago, their forebears had been independent, until dragons had forced their knee to bend. A few, like Tywin Lannister, narrowed their eyes. The West had grown accustomed to the power that came with being close to the Iron Throne, through marriage, wealth, and fear. In the hush, one might have heard a single grain of ash drift to the charred marble. But Robert's voice was unwavering. He had lost too many friends in this war to quibble over trifles. The Targaryen line, he declared, was sundered. That legacy would trouble them no more, if indeed any had survived. He cast a look at Lord Varys's usual spot, as though suspecting the Master of Whispers might be quietly plotting. In truth, he had no taste for hunting down any Targaryens who might have fled across the narrow sea. Let them run to Essos and vanish among the free cities. Let them keep their dragon dreams far from his shores. He had no heart for further bloodshed. The war had cost him his sense of joy and the illusions of youth. Perhaps it was the memory of Lyanna Stark, whose death had stung him like 1,000 wasp bites, that sealed his resolve. Perhaps he had glimpsed a truth many refused to see, that a single throne could never hold the diverse, often warring, peoples of Westeros without the iron fist of tyranny or the fiery threat of dragons. So that morning, with the sun rising over the blackened towers of the Red Keep, the 7 kingdoms were reborn as 7 sovereign domains. The banners of each lord, flown proudly in the broken city, signaled the birth of a new age. Robert had declared it with the same fiery conviction that had set the Iron Throne aflame. The realm, such as it was, would be a gathering of equals. The king that was roared his final decree. Let each kingdom stand or fall by its own strength, forging alliances or rivalries without any single monarch to overshadow them all. The shockwaves rippled far beyond King's Landing. Across the narrow sea, sellswords and exiled lords turned their ears homeward, some cursing the loss of a single seat of power they had hoped to claim, others marveling that such a bold decision could be made by a man they knew chiefly as a warrior. In the north, Eddard Stark looked upon the scattered ravens that arrived daily at Winterfell. A new future was shaping, and his dear friend's choice had turned the old order on its head. If each kingdom stands alone, Ned wondered quietly, gazing from atop the ancient battlements, will we truly find peace, or simply new ways to tear each other apart? Yet he accepted Robert's choice. Ned remembered the swirl of rumors surrounding Lyanna, the Mad King's final days, and the terrible heartbreak of war. Perhaps it was better to let each region's traditions breathe, unchained by a single iron rule. He penned a cautious agreement, recognizing that Robert had no desire for the burdens of a united throne, and took steps to proclaim himself Warden of the North, not under King's decree, but in his own right as the Lord of Winterfell, keeper of those frosty expanses where the old gods still held sway. Generations of Starks had always spoken of the North as a near-sovereign land anyway, distant from the squabbles of southern courts. Meanwhile, the veil trembled. Jon Arryn, who had served as Robert's mentor and guiding hand, recognized the risk of warlords rising, the threat of border skirmishes, and the possibility that the dissolution of central authority might sow chaos. He also knew his adoptive sons, Robert, Eddard, were men of honor, but not necessarily versed in the subtleties of statesmanship. Arryn himself, aging and childless save for a new infant son, found his devotion to Robert tested in this moment. He had pledged to ensure the rebellion's success, but this outcome he had never foreseen. Still, he held the Eyrie with measured calm, sending ravens to each of the kingdoms, calling for a council of lords to discuss how they might maintain peace with no Iron Throne to unite them. A lofty goal, perhaps, but Jon Arryn was not one to stand idle while chaos brewed. In Dorne, Prince Doran Martell received the news with a hush that settled over the water gardens. He recalled the savage fate of Elia Martell and her children at the sack of King's Landing. Perhaps there was poetic justice in the destruction of the symbol of Targaryen rule that had once humiliated Dorne. But he also knew his fiery brother, Oberyn, yearned for vengeance against those responsible. If there was no single king, whom would Oberyn blame for Elia's death? Where could he direct the fury that burned in his heart? Doran, with his cautious and deliberate mind, considered the new era an opportunity to strengthen Dornish independence. They had once resisted Targaryen conquest longer than any other kingdom. Now, if each region was truly free, Dorne could flourish without overshadowing fear from the Iron Throne. Or so he hoped. In the Reach, Mace Tyrell weighed the ramifications for Highgarden's wealth and influence. Once the breadbasket of the Seven Kingdoms, the Reach had always leveraged its fertile lands to maintain favor at court. But if no single court remained, Mace wondered if this new arrangement might benefit them. Trade deals could be struck directly with each kingdom. No share of taxes or harvest would automatically flow to King's Landing. Still, the Tyrells worried about their centuries-old rivalry with the Dornish and the alliances that might sprout among the other kingdoms. Without a unifying crown, alliances and enmities might shift like the wind. In Mace's halls, the lords under his banner debated these matters late into the nights. As for the Westerlands, Lord Tywin Lannister's reaction was the subject of much speculation. A man known for his unbending will and thirst for power, many suspected he would not tolerate a realm without a single seat to rule. The Lannisters, wealthy beyond measure, had seen an opportunity when Robert seized King's Landing. Had not Tywin orchestrated the vile acts that secured Robert's victory, sacking the city at the very moment the Targaryens lost all hope? Yet now, the man from Casterly Rock stood surveying a realm fractured. Some whispered that Tywin might claim a kingship for himself in the west. But would the other kingdoms allow a second unifying throne to rise so soon after the first was destroyed? Tywin's children, Jaime, Cersei, and Tyrion, remained at his side, though each had their own desires. Indeed, what Tywin did next would shape whether this new arrangement would hold or be shattered in its infancy. In the Riverlands, Lord Hoster Tully faced rebuilding from the ruin that war had left behind. Too many times had the Riverlands served as a battleground in conflicts not of their own making. The local lords clung to alliances through marriage, Cat to Eddard Stark, Lisa to Jon Arryn. With no overarching monarchy, how would House Tully safeguard its lands from rapacious neighbors? Hoster received Robert's missives and saw, hidden between the lines, the earnest hope of a man who never wished to bear the weight of a king's crown. Hoster's banners, though, had flown for that crown. Change was upon them, inevitable. Like so many others, he weighed the cost of old loyalties against a new freedom that might serve them well, or cast them adrift in bloodshed. And so the Seven Kingdoms, no longer united but still linked by a history of conquest and rebellion, awaited the next turn of fate's wheel. For Robert Baratheon himself, the momentous decision did not end with the throne's destruction. He stationed himself in the Red Keep for a time, though much of it had been damaged. He spent his days signing dispatches that recognized the lords of each kingdom in their new roles, inviting them to assemble if they wished to form a Grand Council of Westeros, a place for negotiation and mutual defense. But he made it plain that attendance was voluntary. No kingdom was forced to bow, pay taxes, or accept the rulings of others. He added that if any outside threat, like the Iron Islands or a horde of savages from beyond the Narrow Sea, came to Westeros, the council should unite to meet it. Otherwise, let each land govern as it saw fit. The greater portion of his time, however, Robert spent in weary, introspective silence. His closest friends often found him in the courtyard, gazing out over the bay, or in the remains of the throne room, eyes fixed upon the charred patch where the Iron Throne had stood. When his squires and servants approached, he waved them off, preferring a flagon of ale and quiet solitude to any regal ceremony. Gone was the brash laughter that had once echoed in tourneys and feasts. In its place grew something older, sadder, and strangely resolute. Occasionally, Ned Stark would manage to coax from him a few words of the heartache that had led him here. "I wanted to break the wheel," he confessed once, voice ragged, "so no one else would be crushed beneath it." The people of King's Landing, for their part, were stunned and uncertain. Some believed Robert a hero who had freed them from tyrants, while others simply wanted a monarch to fill their empty bellies and keep the peace. Merchants worried about coin, about taxes and trade routes. Small folk wondered who would pay for the city watch, who would keep criminals from roaming the alleys unchecked. Yet Robert's loyalists reassured them that the new council, or their own city governance, would see to it. Time would reveal the truth of that claim. Despite these uncertainties, the torch had been passed. The fate of a continent no longer lay in one king's hands, but in the hands of 7 realms that might choose to stand together or slip apart. And that question, whether unity might be found in a treaty instead of a crown, loomed over every holdfast and great castle in the land. Word reached Pike in the Iron Islands last. Balon Greyjoy, hearing of the throne's destruction, scoffed aloud. The Ironborn had never forgotten their days of independence before Aegon the Conqueror's dragons had scorched their ships. Balon's first thought was to crown himself king of salt and rock. With Robert no longer proclaiming overlordship from the Iron Throne, the notion grew alluring. But would the other kingdoms stand aside and watch the Ironborn raid their coasts without a unifying power to punish them? Balon guessed that alliances might quickly form if the Ironborn took to their old reaving ways. Even so, the allure of a salt-crowned kingship was strong. His dreams churned like the turbulent sea. So many stories, swirling, coiling like the smoke that clung to King's Landing's ruins. The day after he announced the dissolution of the 7 kingdoms, Robert walked alone through the remnants of the Great Hall. Broken pillars of dragonbone decor lay scattered. The Targaryen standards had been burned or torn down, replaced by the stag of House Baratheon flying from the highest turrets, though soon even that might come down if he truly meant to revert to a mere lordship. No more would songs be sung of the black iron seat that had cut and scarred those who dared claim it. The last of the molten steel would soon be carted off, perhaps to be made into nails or horseshoes, if it had any use at all. The warrior king who had fought so hard to gain power now stood as the man who spurned it. The tension of that choice etched into his features like a deep carving in oak. At length Ned Stark joined him. Together they surveyed the blackened floor. "You should have told me," Ned said quietly. "I could have advised you, or at least been by your side." Robert shook his head. "I had to do it alone, Ned. This was my sin to commit." His voice sounded hollow, as if the flames that consumed the throne had burned something inside him, too. "I only hope I haven't doomed us all to more bloodshed. But I couldn't—" He stopped, his big hand fumbling for words. "I couldn't live another day seeing another tyrant take root here, not after we tore down the last. This cursed city has drowned enough lords and ladies in blood. Maybe now it can breathe. Maybe now the rest of the land can breathe." Ned placed a hand on Robert's shoulder, the same comforting touch he'd offered in younger days, before war had hardened them both. "We'll see it through, my friend." Yet even as he spoke, Ned felt the uncertainty coil in his stomach like a viper. Tradition and fear held men in thrall. 1,000 petty feuds might erupt now that each kingdom was its own. The thirst for power rarely vanished. It changed shape, like water poured into a new vessel. What shape would that thirst take in a fractured Westeros? Time would tell, and the first test of the new age was not long in coming. A fortnight after Robert's decree, an envoy arrived at King's Landing from the Westerlands. Tywin Lannister had chosen a path, and the words carried by his messenger would echo in memory for years. The envoy, clad in crimson and gold, gave a deep bow before Robert in the scorched hall. "My lord," he said, voice resonant in the hush. "Lord Tywin sends word from Casterly Rock. He acknowledges your decision. He offers to send his daughter, Cersei Lannister, to serve as an honored guest in the Stormlands, as a gesture of good faith. Further, he requests that you attend a conclave of the great lords, one at which each kingdom's sovereignty might be formally recognized, with binding pledges of mutual non-aggression." A subtle wave of suspicion passed through the gathered courtiers. Robert's battered heart gave a dull pang at the mention of Tywin's daughter. He was aware that Tywin might attempt to ensure House Lannister retained influence by wedding Cersei to a powerful figure, perhaps even to Robert himself, if Robert were foolish enough to take a bride under these new circumstances. Or maybe Tywin's aims were simpler, to secure alliances that would keep Lannister gold flowing freely. Still, Robert nodded. This was precisely what he wanted, for the new order to come together in a council, to keep the fragile peace from fracturing before it began. He agreed to travel, but insisted the meeting take place on neutral ground. Harrenhal was proposed, the largest castle in Westeros, though half-ruined and infamous for ill luck. That ill luck, though, might serve as a kind of grim caution to all attendees. The seat that had once tried to defy dragons had been reduced to a scorched husk, a stark reminder of what unchecked ambition could provoke. And so ravens took flight again across the realm, inviting each domain to send its highest lords and ladies to parley at Harrenhal. Robert parted from King's Landing soon after. He left behind only a skeleton garrison to maintain order and keep the Red Keep from falling to disrepair entirely. The small folk watched him go with anxious eyes. They had hailed him as king, but now he departed claiming no throne, only a desire to see the new order's birth. Some spat that he was abandoning them. Others cheered him as the breaker of chains, though the chains in question had been forged by Targaryens 3 centuries past. The city would not remain quiet for long, for in the absence of central authority, criminals and power-hungry opportunists often slithered from the shadows. The journey to Harrenhal proved somber. The roads were still marred by the aftermath of war. Burned farmsteads, shallow graves along riverbanks, and displaced folk begging for alms at every turn. Robert sent what coin he could spare, though it was never enough. Each time he handed over a copper, his gut twisted with the knowledge that he bore responsibility for this suffering. The rebellion had been necessary, but no war came without a price, and the commoners always paid most dearly. Several days into the trek, Eddard Stark joined him, accompanied by a contingent from the north. Jon Arryn's envoys linked up as well, and soon the column was a patchwork of banners. The direwolf of Stark, the winged falcon of Arryn, the trout of Tully. The men talked quietly around campfires at night, uncertain what to expect. War had ended, but the sweet taste of victory seemed to have soured. They had no great feasting or songs along the way. The nights were filled instead with the sound of the wind howling across war-torn fields. When at last they reached Harrenhal, its black towers loomed, skeletal and foreboding against a cloudy sky. The stone gargoyles that clung to the walls might have been grim watchers, their expressions twisted into perpetual mockery of mortal pride. Within the gates, servants hurried to prepare the halls for a gathering the likes of which Westeros had not seen for centuries. Inside that massive fortress, each lord would represent a realm unto itself, all of them bound by a tenuous notion of cooperation in place of an iron command. One by one, the delegations arrived. House Tyrell's caravan came resplendent, bringing wagons of provisions and fine wines, as if to remind all present of the bounty of the Reach. The Dornish arrived next, a swirl of bright silks and sun-scorched guards, though Prince Doran was nowhere to be seen. He had sent Oberyn and a cousin in his stead, a sure sign that Doran did not fully trust the gathering or was too wary or unwell to make the long journey himself. The men from the Iron Islands made a late entrance, brash and haughty, their rowdy warships moored along the shore of the God's Eye. A hush fell when the Lannisters were spotted cresting the hill. Lord Tywin came in a gilded wheelhouse, flanked by a column of knights in bright crimson cloaks. Cersei and Jaime rode behind him, their golden hair shining, while Tyrion, half hidden in the crowd, peered up at the ramparts with undisguised curiosity. The pomp and splendor brought no comfort, for everyone felt an unspoken tension. The wars of yesterday might give birth to fresh conflicts tomorrow. And so, under the vaulted ceilings of Harrenhal's great hall, with its crumbling hearths and echoing emptiness, the lords and ladies of the 7 kingdoms, now 7 sovereign realms, gathered in uneasy congregation. Tables were set in a wide circle, deliberately avoiding any suggestion of a single head. At the table's heart, the blackened walls soared upward like the ribcage of a long-dead beast, reminding all that time and the tides of power could devour even the greatest strongholds. Robert, broad-shouldered and clad in the simplest attire he could manage, still the fine fabrics of a lord, but devoid of regal ornament, stood and addressed them. He spoke of his reasons, though he needed no great speech to remind them of the Targaryen terror they had overthrown. He recalled Aegon's conquest, the forging of the Iron Throne from 1,000 swords, the cruelty of the Mad King, and the blood spilled by all present to unseat that line. He recounted the final hammer blow that melted the throne to nothing, sealing a promise in steel and fire that no such seat would rise again under his watch. Then he proposed what he had already set in motion. Let each realm stand independent, let each lord or lady style themselves a rightful ruler in their own land, and let them forge alliances or treaties as they saw fit. But so none would attempt to subjugate another by force. Let them all sign a pact of non-aggression. That was his dream. He ended by calling it a Compact of Seven, and suggested that each region pledge to come to the aid of any realm attacked by outside invaders, pirates, sellswords, or foreign armies. Beyond that, each would mind its own affairs. When Robert sat, the hush was like the silence before a squall at sea. Tywin Lannister was the first to rise. With measured tone, he praised Robert's achievement in overthrowing tyranny, then swiftly pivoted to a question. Who would enforce the pact if one kingdom turned on another? Could a realm be cast out, its trade boycotted, if it broke the agreement? He pointed out that the vow of mutual defense cut both ways. What if the Iron Islands or Dorne used that vow to drag the rest of them into border conflicts that were none of their concern? His concerns were practical, grounded in realpolitik, and many present nodded in reluctant agreement. Tywin proposed a permanent council of representatives, one from each realm, stationed either in Harrenhal or in the city of Old Town, or anywhere they chose. That council would arbitrate disputes. Each realm would maintain a small force that could be called upon if the council deemed an attack unjust. Doran Martell laughed out loud, calling Tywin's idea a thinly veiled attempt at forging a new seat of power by committee. The Red Viper's voice echoed in the hall, mocking the notion of letting 6 realms judge the 7th for its behavior. He asked if Tywin would so willingly abide by a council if it were composed of his enemies. The Tyrell bannermen scoffed at Oberyn's boldness, while the Lannister knights bristled. Sparks of tension leaped between them, ancient grudges just waiting for a chance to erupt. It fell to Jon Arryn, soft-spoken, calm-faced, to attempt to soothe the gathering. He voiced his support for the idea of a council, but only if each realm agreed to abide by the group's decisions as binding, which sparked a new round of debate. The Ironborn envoy insisted that no council could dictate what the Ironborn did upon the seas. Their old ways would not be stifled by any committee. The debate raged on for hours. In that time, Mace Tyrell demanded formal recognition of the Reach's shipping rights along the Mander, while the Riverlands insisted they would no longer pay any form of tribute for the passage of goods. The Dornish threatened to cut off all overland routes if they were not guaranteed certain privileges. Tywin and Oberyn exchanged a series of verbal barbs so pointed that the men around them tensed for the clash of steel. Throughout it all, Robert sat with shoulders hunched, bearing the burden of a father watching bickering children. The future was being shaped, but the shape seemed uncertain indeed. Winter might be coming, and unity was as tenuous as a sail in a storm. By the time the dust settled, and the candle flames flickered low, they had reached a fragile agreement. Each realm would sign the Compact of Seven, swearing on the gods they worshipped that no realm would wage war upon the other. If disputes arose, they would first seek the council's intervention, made of 7 representatives, one from each realm, before declaring open conflict. If that council found a realm in breach of the compact, the others were bound to stand against the aggressor, thus discouraging any single kingdom from rash conquests. It was a step, albeit one that left many unanswered questions. What if 2 regions clashed for reasons the other 5 deemed justified? Could a realm simply refuse to abide by the council if it believed the ruling unjust? Such complexities remained unresolved, but at least for one long, candlelit night, they penned their names or seals to the parchment, forging a newborn peace out of the fires of war. When the signatories left the Great Hall, tension still curdled in the corridors. Jaime Lannister swept past Doran Martell with a tight-lipped sneer. Cersei Lannister studied Robert Baratheon from across the courtyard as if he were some puzzle to be solved. Ned Stark withdrew early, conferring with Jon Arryn about the North's intention to remain vigilant at the Neck and how the new arrangement might be tested if raiders from beyond the Wall ever became more than a rumor. Balon Greyjoy's envoy stomped out with a final warning that no piece of parchment could command the sea's loyalty. Robert left last, stepping into the moonlit courtyard with a stoop to his once proud shoulders. It was done, or so he hoped. The next morning, the lords of Westeros parted ways, taking the fresh-baked compact with them like a newborn babe, uncertain if it would thrive or die in its crib. Even after the Harrenhal Council concluded, the aftereffects rippled. Messages flew across the realm, carrying word of the new pact. Lords weighed the words carefully. In taverns, soldiers wondered if they would soon be out of work. Traders speculated about how to maximize profit from the autonomy of each kingdom. In Spartan castles, the old guard questioned whether House Baratheon's radical act would stand the test of time. Weeks turned into months. Robert, joined by Ned Stark and a small entourage, retired to Storm's End for a spell, striving to fortify his own seat and attend to the business of local governance. And oh, how it needed attention. The war had left Storm's End's coffers depleted, the countryside dotted with scarring from the last siege. Crops needed replanting, roads needed repairing, and the people were starved for stability. Robert learned quickly that destroying a throne was far easier than mending a realm. He had traded the burdens of being one king for the daily grind of being a responsible lord. He felt the difference keenly. No longer were his decisions draped in the absolute authority of a monarch. Instead, he negotiated with lesser lords, hammered out disputes about grazing lands, listened to petitions from weavers and fishmongers. Part of him welcomed the simpler tasks, yet the memory of the cost in blood weighed heavily on him. Meanwhile, the other realms faced challenges of their own. Word spread that Balon Greyjoy was forging alliances with certain pirate clans along the Stepstones, emboldened by the lack of a single unified navy to police the seas. The Riverlands and the Westerlands continued to skirmish over old grievances, albeit with no official declaration of war. Localized clashes sprang up near the borders, each side insisting they were acting in self-defense. The council assembled at Harrenhal tried to mediate via ravens, but the results were mixed. Tywin Lannister refused to allow any kangaroo court, as Oberyn labeled it, to oversee how he defended Lannister lands. House Tully, similarly, was reluctant to yield autonomy in how it handled suspected brigands crossing the Red Fork. Both sides insisted the other had violated the pact first. Bloodshed was minimal but present. Anxieties ran high. In Highgarden, Mace Tyrell reveled in new trade opportunities, sending envoys far and wide to negotiate deals. The bounty of the Reach had never been more sought after, now that the crown no longer fixed prices or demanded certain levies. Yet, along with opportunity came risk. Would the Tyrells remain the breadbasket of Westeros, or would ambitious kingdoms look upon that farmland with hungry eyes? Dorne, for its part, withdrew behind the Red Mountains. Prince Doran's health waned, leaving Oberyn and others to represent Dorne's interests. Many believed that Oberyn still harbored a deep grudge against the Lannisters. He seemed oddly quiet after Harrenhal, as if plotting a vengeance that might one day erupt, whether or not a compact existed. Yet for the moment, Dorne's watchwords were caution and survival. They had little interest in new wars, so long as their autonomy remained inviolate. Amid this uneasy peace, time crept onward. The first year after the burning of the Iron Throne saw widespread rebuilding. Harvests were sown, new roads laid, and trade caravans ventured forth with a hopeful spirit. But tensions simmered beneath the surface, for the memory of strife had not yet faded. The small folk waited to see if the new pact would hold. In distant Essos, merchants and exiled nobles watched with fascination. Rumors circulated that the last Targaryens, if any survived, might consider this fractured Westeros an easier realm to retake. But there was no sign of them yet, and Robert privately prayed they would never return. He had no wish to open that chapter again. It was in the second year that trouble truly brewed. Reports came of increasing pirate attacks along the southern coast. A sail fleet, possibly backed by wealthy patrons in the Free Cities, raided towns near the Arbor. Mace Tyrell called upon the Compact of Seven, demanding the other realms dispatch ships to help him repel the invaders. Yet the Ironborn, led now openly by Balon Greyjoy styling himself King of Salt and Rock, seemed to be in league with the raiders, or at least profiting by the chaos, capturing merchant vessels that fled from the initial attacks. When Tyrell's envoys arrived in the north, Ned Stark explained that the north had few ships to spare, especially ocean-going war galleys. Jon Arryn, from the Vale, expressed a willingness to help, but the Vale's navy was modest, designed more for coastal defense than long voyages. The Lannisters, ever calculating, claimed that their resources were engaged in pacifying bandits on their own borders. They offered gold, but no ships. Dorne sent a small squadron from Sunspear, but Oberyn insisted on leading it, which rankled some. The Riverlands were caught up in conflicts with mountain clans near the Trident. So, despite the vow of mutual defense, Mace Tyrell found himself largely alone in facing the pirate menace, with only a token force from Dorne. Murmurs began that the new compact was toothless. What good was a mutual defense if each realm found some excuse not to send aid? Robert, upon receiving the urgent request, read the letter in the windy courtyard of Storm's End. The Tyrells have always been quick to claim preeminence in the south, he muttered grimly to Ned. But I cannot ignore them in their hour of need. The Stormlands may not have many warships, but we do have some, and I have a duty to keep the coasts free of raiders. Let us see if any good can still come of the pact. Within days, Robert gathered what ships he could, aged galleys that had withstood the siege, plus some newly constructed ones, and sailed to join the Tyrell force off the coast near the Arbor. The sea was choppy, the weather foul, as though the gods themselves opposed this new expedition. Yet Robert pressed on, commanding from the prow of his flagship, Stormrider. He wore no crown, only his lord's regalia and a heavy warhammer at his belt. When the pirate fleet finally emerged on the horizon, the Baratheon and Tyrell banners rose, and a fierce naval battle commenced. The clang of steel and the crash of splintering would echoed across the waves. Robert himself fought like a man possessed, leading boarding parties from one ship to the next, his hammer crushing pirate helms and scattering foes. For a moment, it seemed as though the old Robert had returned, the warrior brimming with unstoppable might. Yet the pirates and their Ironborn allies, though outnumbered, were cunning. They used the rocky coastline and swift currents to outmaneuver their pursuers, striking where the Tyrell ships were weakest. Fires broke out on both sides. Bodies fell into the sea. Robert's bold tactics drove the enemy back, but at a steep cost. By the battle's end, the pirates had been repelled for the time being, but many ships from the Stormlands and the Reach were lost or damaged. This partial victory felt hollow, more a stalemate than a true triumph. When the battered fleet limped back to port, Mace Tyrell greeted Robert with forced courtesy, insisting that the threat was not ended, only delayed. He complained bitterly that the Lannisters and the others had not upheld their vow. Robert listened in stony silence, wounded in body and spirit. He had tried to do what was right. Yet perhaps Tywin Lannister and Jon Arryn had not been entirely wrong. Each realm had its own troubles, and building a single navy to safeguard everyone's coasts might only repeat the sins of an all-powerful throne. Robert gave Mace Tyrell what support he could, funds to help rebuild lost vessels, and promised to try again to rally the other realms if the pirates returned. But as he sailed away from the Arbor, he feared that the seeds of disunity had been sown. The question was whether they would choke the harvest of this new order. Back at Storm's End, he found letters from King Balon Greyjoy himself, gloating that the Ironborn needed no council or compact to rule the seas. Greyjoy's fleets grew bolder, raiding the western shores of the Reach, making cautious forays near the Riverlands. The newly formed council demanded that Balon desist, else face the combined might of all the realms. Balon responded with derision. "Come," he wrote, "let us see how united your realms truly are." It was a direct challenge, one that threatened to unravel the fragile peace. Robert realized, grimly, that they stood upon the precipice of a new war. A war that might begin at sea, with the Ironborn reaving, or at some contested land border. He summoned Ned Stark south, wanting the counsel of one of the few men he trusted implicitly. When Ned arrived, Robert took him aside in Storm's End's highest tower, the wind rattling the shutters. "If war comes, my friend, it will be different than our rebellion," he said, voice low. "There'll be no single side, no single cause. This will be a chaos of alliances, turning brother against brother if we're not careful." Ned's voice was grave. "You did what you believed was right by breaking the Iron Throne, Robert. I can't say I disagree, but perhaps we must forge a stronger sense of unity among the lords. If the Ironborn remain unchecked, they'll strike each kingdom in turn. We must show Balon that the pact stands, or it all collapses." Robert glanced at the distant sea, remembering the flames and blood of the recent battle. "It all comes down to trust," he said, "and I wonder if that's something we have too little of in these 7 kingdoms, or however many we truly have now." Despite his doubts, Robert sent ravens again, pleading for a united front. Jon Arryn's Vale replied that it would not mobilize unless Balon threatened them directly. Tywin Lannister, more cautious, agreed to send a handful of ships if it could be proven the Ironborn were attacking Lannister lands. Dorne, uncharacteristically, offered a modest squadron, but only if Oberyn could lead them, stirring unease among the other lords. The Tyrells were already rebuilding their navy from the last engagement. The North, as Ned had said, had little capacity for large-scale naval warfare, and any ships traveling down from White Harbor would take precio. As time. So the stormlands found themselves in a precarious position as the primary shield of the southern coasts once more. Robert brooded over this in the torchlit Great Hall of Storm's End. He stared at the great stag banners overhead, recalling the moment he had melted the Iron Throne. He remembered the searing heat on his face, the roar in his ears, and the fierce hope in his heart that day. He had wanted to break the cycle, free Westeros from the tyranny that had cost his beloved Lyanna her life. And yet, at times, he wondered if he had only traded one set of problems for another. Perhaps it was better this way, though. Even if men disagreed and squabbled, at least there was no single monstrous power that could crush them all. If he had to keep fighting to maintain this fractured peace, then so be it. At least there would be no more mad kings enthroned at King's Landing. Early the next morning, he took his warhammer and went out to the training yard, drilling with the garrison. The men watched him with a mix of awe and concern as he swung the hammer, sweat glistening on his arms. He pushed himself until his muscles burned, as though punishing himself for the realm's uncertain fate. When at last he sank to one knee, gasping for breath, Ned approached quietly. Robert looked up, eyes blazing. "I'll not let it fail," he panted. "We'll show the Ironborn they cannot break us. If it costs my life, I'll see this new age live." Ned helped him rise. "I pray it does not cost you that, Robert. This realm still needs you." Robert barked a short laugh. "The realm needs peace. They've had enough of me." Yet the weeks that followed saw no major moves from Balon Greyjoy. It was as if the Ironborn leader was testing the waters, probing each coast for weakness. The reaving continued, but scattered and unpredictable. Meanwhile, trade still flowed, albeit with higher costs for armed escorts. The tension did not explode into a major war, not yet. In King's Landing, the skeleton garrison maintained a semblance of order. The once grand city that had housed the Iron Throne found itself in a peculiar position, no longer truly the capital of anything. Some noble families departed for the countryside, seeing no future there. Others remained, clinging to memories of the old seat of power. Merchants still thronged the port. Across the sea, travelers marveled at the notion that Westeros had no king. Some believed a new conqueror would rise, forging a throne from fresh swords. Others insisted that Robert's choice was a stroke of genius, and that with time, a stable confederation of realms would emerge. Both possibilities hung in the air, unresolved. In that uncertain climate, the final months of the second year since the throne's destruction crept on. Harvests came and went, the wheels of commerce turned, and day by day, the people of Westeros learned to live without a single king. Some found the change liberating, a chance to shape their future without the shadow of a distant monarch. Others grew fearful, suspecting 1,000 petty tyrants might sprout where one iron seat had once loomed. As for Robert Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, the scars from war and regret lingered. Yet each morning, he rose to don a simpler cloak than any king's mantle. He held court in the castle's modest hall, hearing the pleas of fishermen and farmers. At night, sometimes, he could be found standing on the battlements, gazing out over Shipbreaker Bay. The salt wind whipped at his hair, and the crash of waves against the ancient walls resounded like the echo of the god's own heartbeat. He would set his jaw, remembering the blazing sight of the Iron Throne twisting into melted ruin. No, he did not regret it. He'd poured all his rage and heartbreak into that act, forging a realm where men might not be forced to their knees by a single tyrant. True, the new order was fragile, and storms were gathering, but let them come. He had never feared the storm. The stag did not bend, he thought, even when lightning cracked the sky. And if the gods willed that one day, a mighty leader would emerge to unify the kingdoms once more, they would do so without the cursed seat that had cut so many. The memory of that black, jagged monstrosity was gone in fire. Perhaps that alone was victory enough. He clenched his fists around the cold stone of the battlements, hearing Ned's voice echo in his mind. "We'll see it through, my friend. For the sake of their fallen friends, for the sake of Lyanna, for the sake of all who had perished beneath the Targaryen madness, he would see it through." The wheel was broken. Now came the slow, uncertain work of forging something better from the shards. And though the future was clouded by more than just the sea mists rolling in off Shipbreaker Bay, Robert stood unyielding, determined to hold on to that dream, one day and one battle at a time. Robert Baratheon stood atop the windswept battlements of Storm's End, the cold sea air biting at his cheeks. There was no crown upon his head, only the knowledge that he had undone 3 centuries of Targaryen rule. In quiet moments, he could still feel the heat of the forge fires that had melted the Iron Throne into slag. It was the memory of finality, of an old world ending and something untested taking its place. He remembered the roar of those flames every time he touched the rough stone walls, as if the fire of that fateful night was stored there, waiting to surge back into him. Now, nearly 2 years after his deed, the promise of a freer Westeros felt as tenuous as the gulls circling overhead. He lingered a moment longer, peering down into the courtyard where 6 soldiers drilled in neat rows. A narrow-eyed master-at-arms barked orders, urging them to raise their shields in unison. The men wore the stag sigil, though none spoke of serving a king anymore. Robert had tried to make that clear. He was only Lord of Storm's End, no more or less than the rulers of the Reach or the Westerlands or any other land. Yet a certain awe still clung to him, the aura of the rebel who had toppled the might of House Targaryen. Some nights, he embraced that awe to steel his own resolve. More often, he longed to be rid of it. He pushed away from the parapet, descending the spiral steps. In the great hall, flickering torches dispelled the dimness. They revealed a Spartan, functional room, not nearly as grand as the feasting halls in King's Landing or Highgarden. But Storm's End did not need grandness. Its walls were thick enough to stand against the fiercest storms, as if the castle itself were a symbol of unbowed defiance. At the far end of the hall, Ned Stark awaited him, gray eyes pensive. "We've had word from the garrison in King's Landing," Ned said quietly, holding up a rolled parchment. "They managed to quash a riot in Flea Bottom. Food shortages have made it a tinderbox." Robert grimaced. "I'd almost forgotten that city. Better men than I have tried to keep its peace. Is there any talk of who might fill the power vacuum there? Some upstart calling himself protector or, gods forbid, someone pressing a new claim to be king?" Ned shook his head. "No one with the steel to claim kingship, but the city watch is stretched thin. The Red Keep is half empty, the gold cloaks lacking leadership. Some petty lords hover in the wings, eyeing the wealth of the city. If we're not careful, King's Landing could become a nest of vipers. At that, Robert let out a humorless laugh. Let it. If they cannot abide by the new order, let them see how far they get when each kingdom stands as its own shield. I've no interest in marching in there to restore a monarchy we've left behind. Ned's brow furrowed. A monarchy, no. But a city teeming with thousands of small folk shouldn't be abandoned to chaos. Even if we are no longer bound to them by a throne, the city is part of the Crownlands, or what used to be the Crownlands. I sometimes wonder if we might not need to propose a caretaker or a council to govern it. No realm truly claims it, though you. I claim Storm's End, Robert interjected brusquely. What remains of the Crownlands is for any man or woman living there to govern, so long as they abide by the Compact of Seven. We all agreed to keep trade open and refrain from waging war on each other. If the City Watch cannot keep the peace, the local lords can form their own council. That is what they've attempted, Ned said. But men's ambitions flourish in the shadows. Varys was the one who kept them in check, and Varys has vanished. No one quite knows where the spider fled. Robert gave a derisive snort. Likely slithered away to some corner of Essos, peddling secrets to the highest bidder, or plotting a Targaryen restoration, if any Targaryens remain across the sea. His jaw set. Even the thought of that name reawakened old bitterness, though it was dulled by time. But we've enough to worry about here. Let the city find its footing. If the Watch calls on me, I'll send a few squads. That's all I can spare, unless I risk leaving the Stormlands defenseless. Ned said nothing. He respected Robert's caution, though it pained him to see the capital, once the heart of the realm, adrift. In truth, the entire continent felt adrift. The Iron Throne had held Westeros together with a mixture of fear and tradition for centuries. Now, each kingdom shaped its own fate, forging new alliances or relitigating old grudges, with only a paper-thin compact to keep swords sheathed. They left the hall and headed to a small solar where letters and raven scrolls piled up. The thick wooden table was scarred by years of use. Rosters of men, grain tallies, and messages from the scattered villages of the Stormlands lay atop it. Robert rifled through them, grimacing at each new request for men, money, or ships. Yet his gaze sharpened at the sight of one particular scroll, stamped with the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen. He snatched it up, his heartbeat quickening at the improbable sight. Gods, do my eyes deceive me? Robert muttered. He broke the seal, half expecting it to be a ruse. Ned moved closer. Targaryen. Inside was a short letter, penned in Essos. The script was elegant, swirling loops of black ink, and the brief words claimed to speak on behalf of Viserys of House Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne. Robert read it aloud. Lord of Storm's End, you have broken the seat my family forged with fire and blood. You have shattered our birthright and spurned the rightful monarchy of Westeros. You have turned my father's murderers into lords, and by your hand, my sister and I were driven into exile. Yet I remain resolute. I will reclaim what is mine, whether it be from your grip or from the chaos you have sown. Remember that a dragon is not so easily cast aside. Signed, Viserys Targaryen, the third of his name. Robert's scowl deepened. The fool claims to sign himself, the third of his name, as if such titles matter now. His hand trembled in anger. Old wounds tore open. Should I be worried that some Essosi prince is underwriting the return of Targaryens to Westeros? Or is this the empty boast of a boy? Ned pressed his lips together. It might be no idle threat, Robert. Viserys and his sister Daenerys are rumored to be in the Free Cities. Some say they live under the patronage of Magister Illyrio Mopatis in Pentos. Others claim Bravos. If they gather allies, or if the Dothraki were to be enticed to cross the narrow sea. Robert's voice cut like steel. Then we face them. The Iron Throne is gone. Even if Viserys tries to land an army here, the realms are no longer automatically subject to one seat. He'd have to subjugate each kingdom individually. I doubt the Sellsword companies or the Dothraki would unite behind a boy who has no dragons. The Targaryens lost that advantage over a century ago. Ned nodded in cautious agreement, though anxiety churned in his gut. "We should send warning to the other realms. Let them know a Targaryen might attempt to return. The last thing we need is another war, especially with the Greyjoys prowling the seas and tensions still high between the Lannisters and the Martells." Robert sighed, looking suddenly weary. "Yes, we'll do that, though Tywin Lannister probably already knows. That man's spies have ears in every port." He tossed the letter aside. "It changes little. Let Viserys rant across the narrow sea. I've broken the throne and the realm is free. If he dares set foot on these shores, let him try forging a new seat of power. He'll find the kingdoms less welcoming than he might think." Ned set his hand on Robert's shoulder, worried at how the mere mention of a Targaryen resurrected Old Fury. "We'll stand watchful." They turned to other matters, drafting responses to urgent petitions, sending cautious replies to lesser lords. By midday, Robert's head pounded. He had not slept well for days, since returning from that naval skirmish with the pirates who plagued the Reach. The specter of Balon Greyjoy's ambition loomed, though so far the Ironborn had confined themselves to sporadic raids. In the afternoon, a messenger arrived from the harbor. A single ship out of Sunspear had docked near the Rainwood, bearing letters from Dorne. Robert's expression darkened as he recalled Prince Doran Martell's tepid acceptance of the new order. Dorne had recognized independence readily enough, but none had forgotten the brutal fate of Elia Martell and her children during the sack of King's Landing. Nor had anyone forgotten Oberyn Martell's vow of vengeance. Word was that Oberyn had recently led a small squadron to help repel the southern pirates, cooperating, strangely enough, with the Tyrells, though that cooperation was uneasy. The messenger laid out a sealed letter emblazoned with a sun and spear sigil, handing it to Ned. Ned glanced over it, then read it aloud at Robert's urging. "To Lord Robert Baratheon of the Stormlands, you have no doubt heard how Oberyn Martell aided Lord Mace Tyrell against pirate incursions along the Arbor. Dorne kept its word under the Compact of Seven, providing ships and men. I write to request formal acknowledgement that Dorne's assistance saved many ships from destruction. My brother also reports that Tyrell forces refused to share spoils of captured pirate vessels equitably. We do not seek conflict, but we insist on fair treatment under the pact we have all signed. I would also inform you that tensions smolder between Dorne and the Westerlands due to past grievances. The murder of my sister Elia and her children remains unpunished. We hold the Lannisters responsible for that travesty, yet we abide by the compact, so long as it is not twisted to shield those who shed Dornish blood. I humbly advise that you lend your voice to ensure none forget the crimes that toppled the Targaryen dynasty. With respect, Prince Doran Martell, Prince of Dorne, Lord of Sunspear." A silence stretched. Robert rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Prince Doran wants me to publicly condemn Tywin Lannister's role in the sack. Probably also wants me to call out the Mountain, Gregor Clegane, for the blood he spilled in Aerys' final days. By the gods, we are still reaping the harvest of that war." Ned's jaw clenched at the memory of the atrocities. "Those crimes still haunt the realm, but you know Tywin Lannister. He'll never bend the knee in apology nor accept blame. And if we publicly name him as a war criminal, we risk igniting a feud that might tear the compact apart." Robert paced across the solar, each step echoing. "Yet Dorne's grievance is no minor thing. Oberyn has not let it go, no matter how much time passes. He cooperated with Mace Tyrell only because the pirates threatened both their coasts. If we keep ignoring what happened to Elia and her children, one day Oberyn will strike. I can't see him letting it lie." Ned blew out a breath. "We cannot erase the past. The question is whether we can keep it from destroying the future. Perhaps we should propose a council hearing of some sort, a private one, not to condemn Tywin publicly, but to hear Dorne's claims. If the Lannisters refuse to attend, that in itself is telling." Robert grimaced. "Hells, I despise councils, especially those that rehash old wounds. But if it keeps the compact from shattering, I'll do it. The alternative is allowing festering anger to break out into open war between Dorne and the Westerlands, and we can't allow that. The Greyjoys would pounce on any such distraction." Ned nodded. I'll draft a measured response to Doran, acknowledging the wrongdoing but urging a private resolution. It might buy us time, and perhaps we can nudge Tywin towards some sort of grudging reparation, gold or an apology, or something that Oberyn might accept. Robert snorted. Tywin apologize? I have better chances of growing wings. But he didn't forbid the attempt. Any chance of maintaining peace was worth the effort. They moved on to read other dispatches. A note from Jon Arryn in the Vale, still urging more formal structures for the Compact's council. A petition from a group of merchants in Tarth complaining about Ironborn raiders near the Stepstones. And a letter from Edmure Tully, newly enthroned as Lord of Riverrun after his father Hoster's declining health forced him to step back. Edmure worried about recurrent clashes on the border with the Westerlands. Tywin's knights had pursued bandits onto Riverland's territory, and blood was shed. Though no official war was declared, the region was becoming a patchwork of violence. By dusk, Robert felt wearier than he had on any battlefield. The responsibilities of forging a new order weighed heavier than the mightiest warhammer. He dismissed the scribes and lesser lords, retiring to his private chambers. Ned lingered behind, exchanging a few quiet words with the Castellan about the day's tasks. When Ned finally joined Robert, he found him standing by a narrow window, staring into the orange glow of sunset across the sea. "Robert," Ned said gently, "you've been at this since dawn. You should eat, rest." Robert turned, a faint smirk twisting his lips. It's simpler to starve than it is to feed the realm's endless hunger for answers and solutions. Everything's coming undone at the seams. Ned approached. Men said the same under the Targaryen kings. Even under the best of them, the realm still frayed. We have a chance to do better now if we keep to the path. Robert's gaze dropped. I do not regret the throne's destruction. I'd do it again, for all the illusions I once held. But some days, I wonder if we're simply living in the quiet before a greater storm. Ned drew in a slow breath. Storm or not, we'll face it. We have no choice, my friend. They shared a silent moment, old comrades bonded by shared struggle. Then Ned guided Robert from the chamber, urging him to join the supper table. Servants brought out a meager spread of salted fish, barley bread, and a thick stew. Robert ate little, though the Stormlands staple fare usually pleased him. Wine was poured, but he drank only a single cup. The days when he caroused and roared with laughter seemed far behind, a memory from a different life. After the meal, Ned withdrew to his own rooms, leaving Robert to brood by the dying fire. He dozed fitfully and dreamed of a throne wreathed in flames. In the dream, the molten metal seeped across a marble floor, rising higher and higher, until it threatened to drown him. He awoke with a gasp, drenched in sweat. The pre-dawn sky was just beginning to lighten. His mind churned with half-formed thoughts. Viserys Targaryen's threat, Dorne's call for justice, Tywin's arrogance, Balon Greyjoy's hunger for a salt-crowned kingdom. 7 curses upon them all. Before the sun rose, fully he made his way to the armory courtyard. He donned a padded gambeson and took up his warhammer, practicing swings against a straw target. Each blow sent reverberations through his arms and chest, a jolt of brutal honesty in a world of slippery politics. This was where he felt most himself, amid sweat and the ring of steel. At times, the straw man became the face of the Mad King. At others, it was Rhaegar Targaryen. At others still, it was his own reflection, mocking him for chasing an elusive peace. When the sun's first rays gleamed over the walls, Ned Stark arrived, rubbing the stiffness from his neck. "Restless night?" he asked. Robert nodded curtly, then slammed the hammer into the target again, scattering straw. "We should ride today, see the fields near Parchments, and talk to the farmers. I need to remind myself what life is like for the small folk away from these walls." Ned offered a faint smile. "A wise thought. I'll gather a small escort." "Small," Robert emphasized. "I don't want a procession, just a handful of men. The small folk don't need pomp." So after a quick breakfast of bread and honey, they rode out. The day was clear, a crisp wind rolling off the sea. The farmland around Storm's End was rugged but fertile, with scattered hamlets protected by the castle's presence. Robert greeted the villagers they passed, asking after their health, their harvest. Some looked stunned to see him riding among them. They bowed or curtsied, uncertain what title to call him. King? Lord? Robert didn't mind. He doled out a few coins, listened to complaints about sea raiders or tax burdens. The stormlands demanded a certain levy for upkeep of roads and watchtowers, but Robert tried to keep it modest. At midday, they dismounted near a stream to water the horses. A group of children gathered, gawking at the big man in battered armor. One boy spoke up boldly, "Lord, is it true you slew a dragon?" Robert paused, remembering the stories told of the rebellion, that Rhaegar's dragon sigil had fallen at the Trident, that Robert's warhammer had ended the Targaryen line. He mustered a faint smile. "No, lad, the only dragons I slew were on banners. Real dragons have been dead a long time." The child frowned. "But we heard you melted a throne made o' dragonfire." Pa said it was from all the swords the Targaryens took. Robert exchanged a wry glance with Ned. "Aye, that part's true. The Iron Throne's gone. No one man rules the realm now." "So who does?" asked another child. Robert crouched, meeting the child's eyes. He realized how strange this all must seem to them. The legends of kings undone, their mighty seat of power destroyed. Each land has its own lord or lady, and we've an agreement of sorts that keeps us all from war. "Sounds complicated," the boy said, wrinkling his nose. "That it is," Robert chuckled. "But maybe a future grows from it." He ruffled the boy's hair, then rose. For a moment, he felt something close to hope. If a new generation grew up without a single monstrous throne overshadowing them, perhaps they would also be free of the resentments that had plagued the older bloodlines. They continued on, passing orchard groves and farmland. Many of the dwellings bore scars from the recent war, burned beams, half-collapsed barns. Yet the people worked diligently to rebuild. Storm's End's men-at-arms were visible on patrol, deterring brigands. A sense of relative peace had settled here, if nowhere else. It reminded Robert that the Stormlands might indeed stand firm if trouble arose. He was proud of them in spite of his general weariness. Late in the afternoon, they turned back, riding at a leisurely pace. As they neared the castle, a horn sounded from the gatehouse, signaling an arrival. By the time they dismounted in the courtyard, a group of travelers could be seen handing their reins to the stable hands. At the group's center was a tall, broad knight wearing a simple surcoat of deep green. To Robert's surprise, it was Ser Barristan Selmy. "Barristan," Robert called, striding forward. The older knight turned, his face lighting with respect. Selmy had once been Lord Commander of the Kingsguard under the Targaryens, but had served Robert loyally when the war ended. Now he was something of a wandering champion, carrying out tasks of chivalry and mediation in this fractured realm. Rumor said he had quietly resigned his post when the monarchy ended, yet he was still revered as the greatest living knight in Westeros. "My lord," Selmy said, bowing. His white hair glinted in the evening light. "I come with tidings from King's Landing, and from parts beyond." Robert motioned for him to walk inside, away from prying ears. Ned fell in step beside them, eyes keen. In a small side hall, they gathered around a rough-hewn table, servants bringing ale. Robert sat heavily. "Speak, Barristan. Start with King's Landing." Selmy's features were grave. "The city is restless. Without the presence of a king or a strong hand, the gold cloaks struggle to keep order. Petty lords vie for influence. There have been murders in the streets. Rumors swirl that certain factions want to crown someone, anyone, to bring back stability." Robert grunted. "Who among them has the gall to claim a crown?" Selmy hesitated. "No one has formally tried. Yet I've heard Lord Giles Rosby's name whispered. Also some lesser lords like Stokeworth or Hayford. But they lack the authority. The small folk are torn. Some say they'd welcome the Targaryens back, that at least under them, the city had a certain order." At that, Robert pounded a fist on the table. "Fools. They forget Aerys was called the Mad King for good reason. They want to jump from a frying pan back into dragonfire." Selmy bowed his head. People are frightened. Hunger gnaws at them. Disease has flared in Flea Bottom. There's no centralized relief. The Red Keep is half in ruin. The lords who remain mostly barricade themselves in manors across the city or behind their own cells' word guards. Ned exhaled. We might need to send some measure of aid. If the city descends into full riot, it could become a haven for criminals or worse. And if a Targaryen invasion rumor spreads, the desperate might cling to that hope. Barristan gave a small nod. I have tried to rally the more honorable men, but I can only do so much. Lord Varys's absence is keenly felt. His little birds once kept the pot from boiling over. Robert's expression was stony. So be it. I'll send a letter to my castellan there, authorize what coin I can spare for bread and watch patrols. But no more. If the local lords can't keep order, they'll suffer the consequences. Selmy pressed his lips together, but did not argue. Next, he lowered his voice, as if the very walls might be listening. There's another matter. I traveled to Duskendale and Maidenpool on my way here, speaking with knights who have returned from Pentos. They claim that Viserys Targaryen, the so-called third of his name, has been fostering an alliance with certain powerful magisters. Word is that he's sought out the Golden Company as well, those exiled sellswords once founded by Bittersteel, loyal to the Blackfire line. If he secures their backing, he might attempt to land in Westeros. Ned felt a chill. The Golden Company is formidable. They've never broken a contract, and they boast seasoned fighters from many wars. If Viserys raises their banner, the discontented in Westeros might rally to him. They see only the name Targaryen and dream of dragon conquest again. Robert's eyes narrowed. We broke the Targaryens. Any who want them back are fools. But if the Golden Company invades, we face a real threat. We rely on the idea that each kingdom stands alone, but that also means each must decide whether to fight or yield if Viserys arrives. He might pick them off, one by one, until the entire realm is forced to bow. Barristan spread his hands. We cannot know how serious Viserys is, but the rumors persist, and a boy with vengeance on his mind can be dangerously persuasive, especially if others with wealth and power whisper in his ear. Robert nodded grimly. I'll send word to the other lords through the council. At the very least, we must present a united front. If one kingdom welcomes Viserys, or tries to use him as a pawn, we'll all pay for it. The Greyjoys might even join him if they think it will hurt the rest of us. Selmy cleared his throat. Speaking of the Greyjoys, I have news as well. Their ships prowl near the Shield Islands. The Ironborn capture merchant vessels from Lys and Tyrosh, not just Westerosi ships. Balon Greyjoy seems to be assembling quite a fleet. He might be planning to proclaim himself king of the Isles and the North Sea, or some such outlandish claim. Robert's brow knitted. We can't let the Ironborn grow too bold. Our last naval clash was inconclusive. If they choke off trade, the cities will starve. The North will be safe from direct invasion, but White Harbor depends on shipping. The Reach and the Westerlands rely on sea trade as well. Everyone's threatened. Ned nodded. We must call upon the Compact. If Balon refuses to curb his raids, the other realms must band together. This was precisely what we agreed to do, stand against an external threat. But the Ironborn aren't truly external, Robert retorted. They're just a separate kingdom now, albeit a troublesome one. Some might question whether the Compact covers that. And truthfully, who among the lords is eager to raise a new war fleet? The Tyrells tried, and we saw how that ended, with heavy losses and no decisive victory. Barristan's eyes were weary. All these concerns, Viserys, the Ironborn, unrest in King's Landing. If they converge at once, Westeros could be plunged into chaos. The memory of the rebellion's bloodshed is still fresh. People are wary, hungry, uncertain, and an uncertain realm is ripe for conquest. The words hung in the air like a funeral dirge. Robert stared at the table, one large hand curled into a fist. I will not let that happen. Not after all we've sacrificed. We need a new approach. He turned to Ned. We must rally the council. Let each realm send its envoys again. Harrenhal is too cursed. Let's choose a new venue. Riverrun, perhaps, if Lord Edmure will host. Or the Crossroads, if it can accommodate so many. Anywhere but that black ruin. Ned inclined his head. Riverrun might serve. Edmure Tully has been eager for a chance to strengthen ties, especially after those border skirmishes with the Lannisters. A grand council there might help unify men behind a defensive stance. We should also invite the Ironborn to send representatives. Force them to explain their raids. And if they refuse, Robert said with a savage twist to his mouth, that refusal will be all the reason we need to form a fleet against them. Balon Greyjoy can't be allowed to strangle us at sea. Barristan offered a reluctant nod. I'll carry your call to the Vale, the Reach, and Dorne as well, though I suspect Lord Tywin will not be easily swayed to come in person. He might send someone else. Let him, Robert muttered, as long as we have a Lannister representative with authority to negotiate. We have no time for half measures. Thus began the planning for another grand gathering. This one, they hoped, might settle more than just the immediate disputes. It might lay out a clearer system for punishing realms that violated the compact's terms. It might also address the Targaryen threat, binding each region to reject any attempt by Viserys to gain a foothold. The risk of it all was staggering. If the council collapsed, war could erupt along every border, and old resentments would fuel the fires. Barristan Selmy departed the next morning with fresh letters sealed by Robert's own hand, each calling upon the High Lords to convene at Riverrun in 3 moons' time. Ned Stark agreed to remain in the Stormlands for a few more weeks, helping Robert organize food supplies and finances for the journey. Meanwhile, ravens sped across the skies of Westeros, carrying words that could shape the fate of the entire land. 3 moons passed in a tumult of preparations. Lords across the realm debated whether to attend, some suspecting a trap or an attempt by Robert to impose a new monarchy. Others saw it as a chance to safeguard their independence by forging stricter rules for the compact. Amid these concerns, rumors about Viserys Targaryen's activities in Essos grew more insistent. Certain merchants from Pentos claimed he was close to sealing a contract with the Golden Company. Others scoffed that the Sellswords would never stake their fortunes on a boy with no dragons. Still, tension thrummed beneath every conversation. As the appointed date drew nigh, delegations began traveling to Riverrun. The keep, with its red sandstone walls and confluence of rivers, bustled like a fairground. Encampments sprawled outside the walls, bright pavilions bearing sigils from every corner. The golden roses of House Tyrell, the sun and spear of House Martell, the falcon of House Arryn, the golden lion of House Lannister, the flaming heart of Stannis Baratheon, who now ruled Dragonstone independently, and countless lesser lords from the Riverlands, the Vale, the Westerlands, the Reach, Dorne, and the North. Edmure Tully, eager to prove himself a capable host, spared no expense. The fish ponds and gardens of Riverrun were thronged with guests. Musicians played day and night, though many lords wore grim expressions, as if anticipating that the real battles would be fought with words. Cat Stark was present too, having traveled south with Ned. She busied herself ensuring the accommodations were comfortable. Even the most fractious lord might hold his tongue when plied with good food and better wine, at least for a short while. Robert arrived a day before the official start of the council, flanked by a retinue of Stormland knights and Ned Stark's guard. He greeted Edmure with a hearty embrace, remembering how the Tullys had supported him in the rebellion. But the lines on Robert's face were deeper than before. Old triumphs offered little solace for the troubles that lay ahead. When he entered Riverrun's hall, he found Tywin Lannister already seated with a goblet of wine, accompanied by Jaime and Tyrion. Cersei, for once, was not in sight. Rumor said she remained in the Westerlands. The tension between Robert and Tywin was palpable. They had been uneasy allies after the rebellion, but Tywin's role in the sack and Robert's destruction of the throne created lingering distrust. Across the hall, Doran Martell lounged with a predatory grace, exchanging sharp words with a group of Dornish lords. Prince Doran had not come in person, his health rumored to be poor, so Oberyn stood as his voice. Mace Tyrell was also present, resplendent in bright green attire, speaking in a jovial tone with the lords of the Reach. Jon Arryn arrived soon after Robert, accompanied by a small retinue from the Vale, including young Robert Arryn, still a toddler in the arms of a wet nurse, far too young to understand the gravity of the moment. The Ironborn delegation was the last to appear, led by Balon Greyjoy's brother, Victarion, a hulking man with cold eyes. No sign of Balon himself. A message had preceded them, claiming the King of Salt and Rock was too occupied to attend. That had sparked immediate outrage among some lords who insisted Balon be here if he truly respected the compact. When the Great Hall finally rang with the arrival bell, Edmure Tully called for calm. Each realm's lords and envoys took their seats at a massive oval table set up in the center of the hall. The castle servants had removed the usual dining tables, leaving ample room for a single, unbroken ring of chairs. No one sat at the head, for there was no head, an intentional design to reflect their supposed equality. Yet even that arrangement drew pointed looks. Tywin placed himself at one side, forcing Oberyn to sit nearly opposite him. Robert, near Edmure, ended up across from Victarion Greyjoy. Glances flared like sparks between old enemies and uneasy allies. Edmure cleared his throat, sweating a bit despite the coolness of the chamber. "My lords, my ladies, we gather here under the terms of the Compact of Seven, which binds our realms in mutual respect and defense. Our goal is to address pressing threats, seaborne raids, rumored invasions from Essos, and any friction among our borders. May the gods grant us wisdom." A hush followed. Then Robert Baratheon rose, his voice resonant. "I am no king, as you well know, yet I helped forge this compact to prevent another tyrant from ruling over us. We stand here as 7 realms, each sovereign. But we face dangers that do not respect our lines on a map. If we cannot agree on joint measures, we risk all we fought to gain. Let us speak plainly." Tywin Lannister's green eyes flicked around the table. He set down his goblet. "Very well, I'll speak plainly. The Westerlands has suffered repeated incursions by river lords crossing our borders and by mountain clans emboldened by the Vale's negligence. Before we talk of external threats, we should see each realm keep its own house in order. If you cannot control your brigands and marauders, do not expect us to stand idle when they spill into our lands." A flush crept up Edmure Tully's cheeks. "We have not turned a blind eye, Lord Tywin. We've pursued the bandits. But your knights have at times crossed into our territory without warning, burning homesteads they claim shelter outlaws. Innocents have died. We cannot allow that. And we cannot allow criminals to hide in your territory," Tywin retorted. "Perhaps you should keep them from crossing the border in the first place." Doran Martell cut in, his tone dripping scorn. "Spare us the lectures, Lannister. We all know you have a penchant for brutal justice. Or should we revisit the events in King's Landing when Elia Martell and her children?" Tywin's gaze turned frigid. "That subject is tiresome. Any rehashing of those days is a transparent attempt to sow discord." Oberyn sneered. "Discord? There is no more Targaryen throne to protect you from accountability, my lord. Someday your man Gregor Clegane will face a reckoning. Dorne has not forgotten." Before Tywin could respond, Victarion Greyjoy's deep voice boomed. "What is all this talk of old grudges and border troubles? The sea is our domain. We care not for your petty feuds. However, we do object to the notion that our reaving is any more criminal than your raids upon each other. We take what is ours. The Ironborn have no need for your permission." Angry murmurs rippled around the table. Mace Tyrell stood so abruptly his chair scraped the floor. "You have been attacking merchant ships under the banners of the Reach. That is an act of war, my Lord Greyjoy, unless you are prepared to pay for the cargo you have stolen." Victarion shrugged massively. "You claim the seas, but you cannot hold them. We do no more than exercise our freedom. The Targaryens once forced us to bend. Now that the throne is gone, we are kings of the salt, as is our ancient right." Jon Arryn finally rose, palms up in a gesture of appeasement. "My lords, please. We came here to mend these rifts. The Compact of Seven forbids one kingdom from warring against another without first attempting resolution. If the Iron Islands continue these raids, The rest of us have grounds to unite against them. Is that truly what you wish, Lord Greyjoy? Victarion's brow furrowed. You speak for the rest, do you? I see plenty of squabbling among you. The Lannisters and Martells nearly at each other's throats. The Riverlands and Westerlands in conflict, and you expect to unite. Robert's voice thundered across the hall. We can, if forced. The question is whether you wish to test that. Balon Greyjoy's refusal to attend is an insult. It suggests he thinks we won't act collectively. He's mistaken. We have enough ships to blockade Pike if need be. Victarion bared his teeth in something that wasn't quite a smile. Do you? After losing so many vessels to pirates? After bickering among yourselves? You can try. The sea is wide and hungry. Ned Stark stood, speaking for the first time. We do not wish to escalate, Lord Greyjoy, but if you force our hand, we will respond. The North, the Reach, the Vale, the Riverlands, the Westerlands, Dorne, and the Stormlands combined could raise a fleet capable of matching yours. Mace Tyrell nodded vigorously. My shipyards in Old Town and along the Mander are rebuilding. We will surpass the Ironborn if we must. Even Dorne can supply vessels from Sunspear. Oberyn smirked. I'd relish the chance. The tension was thick enough to taste. Victarion folded his massive arms. We'll not bow to threats, but I'll convey your words to my brother. Don't expect him to yield simply because you wave parchments. The old way is not undone by talk. As that confrontation cooled, Edmure Tully seized the moment to shift the discussion. There is also the matter of Essos. We have reliable reports that Viserys Targaryen seeks to invade. If the Golden Company sides with him, do we stand united in opposition? Or would any realm see advantage in welcoming him? He was not bold enough to look directly at Tywin, but some in the hall did. Rumors circulated that Tywin might consider backing a Targaryen restoration if it undermined Robert or the Martells, but that was mere speculation. Tywin's face was inscrutable. It was Jaime who spoke, surprising many. House Lannister has no intention of siding with a Targaryen. We remember well how Aerys repaid loyalty. We also know Robert Baratheon bested Rhaegar on the Trident. The Targaryens are finished. If Viserys tries to land in the Westerlands, we'll repel him. Oberyn let out a mirthless chuckle. Spoken by the Kingslayer's brother. How fitting. But your words ring true enough. I doubt the Targaryens would trust you any more than you trust them. Jaime glowered, but did not bite. Tywin sipped his wine in silence, allowing his son to handle the jibe. Robert hammered a fist on the table. We must make it plain, then. If Viserys attempts an invasion, we respond as one. No realm offers him sanctuary. We will coordinate our forces, drive him back into the sea. That is the only way to prevent a second coming of the War of the Usurper. Jon Arryn cleared his throat. This requires preparation. We cannot wait until an army lands to scramble. A portion of each realm's forces should be ready, and we should designate rallying points. If the threat emerges in Dorne, the Dornish must hold them at bay until reinforcements arrive. If it's the Vale or the Crownlands, similarly. We must adopt a measure of shared defense. Who decides how many men each realm should keep standing? Mace Tyrell asked. That sounds like a tax in men. We would pay for them, feed them, and keep them idle. Jon Arryn sighed. It would be wise if each realm contributed a set proportion. But if you prefer to risk being caught unprepared, you can do so. The entire point of the compact is mutual defense, but it only works if we're coordinated. At that, a fresh wave of debate rolled through the lords. Some, like Ned, Jon, and Edmure, argued strongly for a standardized approach. Others, like Tywin, insisted each realm had the right to manage its own forces. Oberyn raised concerns that letting outsiders station troops near Dorne's borders was unacceptable. The Greyjoy delegation scoffed at any notion of a standing army on Pike. Voices rose, tempers flared. Night fell before they could reach agreement. Edmure called a pause, inviting everyone to feast in the castle's great banquet hall. The tension only partially eased under the flow of wine and roasted meats. Men who had not seen each other since the rebellion eyed each other warily. Robert drank more than usual that night, though he tried to keep his wits. He was seated near Tywin Lannister, which made for a strained meal, but courtesy demanded they exchange civilities. In a quieter corner, Ned spoke with Jon Arryn about the need to formalize a leadership structure for the council. "Someone must serve as a presiding officer," Ned observed, "or each meeting will dissolve into bickering. Not a king, but a moderator." Jon rubbed his temples. "Yes, but who? You or Robert might be seen as trying to resurrect the monarchy. Tywin would be unacceptable to half the realm. Mace Tyrell is widely viewed as pompous. Doran Martell is absent. Balon Greyjoy is absent. The Tullys are hosting, perhaps Edmure, but he's new to lordship." Ned sighed. "A rotation of presiding officers, perhaps? Each realm takes a turn hosting or leading. That might preserve equality. It might also lead to inconsistency," Jon muttered. "But perhaps it's a start." The feast wound on, growing louder as the wine flowed. Arguments flared at different tables. Once or twice, Robert had to shoot a warning glare at Oberyn and Jaime when their barbs threatened to erupt into violence. Eventually, the lords drifted to their chambers or pavilions. The next morning, the council resumed in a less formal setting. Small groups gathering in antechambers, gardens, and corridors to negotiate deals. Alliances formed, dissolved, and reformed in a matter of hours. Certain lords from the Westerlands privately spoke with the river lords about local truces. Dornish delegates cornered Tyrell envoys about compensation for the naval battles near the Arbor. The Greyjoys mostly scowled, unwilling to make any concessions. Over all of it loomed the possibility of a new Targaryen threat, drawing both fear and scorn. It took a full week of heated discussions before any measure of consensus emerged. On the final day, they gathered again in the Grand Hall of Riverrun to sign what became known as the Second Compact, an expanded agreement clarifying that any realm that committed aggression against another without first seeking arbitration would face collective retaliation from all signatories. If the Targaryens or any other foreign power attempted invasion, the realms would coordinate a joint defense, sharing costs based on a ratio of wealth and manpower. Raiding on the seas by the Ironborn or any other party would be treated as a violation of the compact unless it was sanctioned by mutual agreement, a notion Victarion Greyjoy found laughable, but he still signed under protest, presumably to buy time. A rotating council of 7 wardens, one from each realm, would convene annually to mediate disputes. Though warden was a term reminiscent of the old monarchy, it was repurposed here to denote watchers over the peace, not subordinates of a king. Each warden served a year-long term as presiding officer, with the next realm's representative taking over afterward. Signatures and seals were affixed. Even Victarion pressed the Kraken seal of House Greyjoy to the parchment, though his bitter glare suggested it was done grudgingly. Tywin Lannister ensured that the language was carefully crafted to allow each realm significant leeway in internal matters, but he did not refuse to sign. The Martell representative, Oberyn, sealed it with a flourish, though his eyes still flickered with unquenched vengeance whenever the topic of Elia arose. Mace Tyrell made a show of bravado, proclaiming the new agreement a triumphant step for Westeros, though some suspected he simply wanted to avoid further naval losses to the Ironborn. Jon Arryn, Ned Stark, Edmure Tully, and Robert Baratheon concluded the final round of signings. For better or worse, the meeting ended with the lords dispersing to their domains under this new pledge. Yet as the caravans departed Riverrun, no one felt entirely secure. "We have words on parchment," Ned murmured to Robert on the ramparts, watching the columns of riders vanish into the autumn haze. "But men may break words as easily as a twig in a winter storm." Robert's face was stony. "If they break them, they'll face our combined might. That's something, at least. The Greyjoys must realize they can't fight us all at once. Tywin and Oberyn must see that open conflict will draw in the other kingdoms. Perhaps fear will keep this peace, if not love." "It's a fragile peace," Ned said. "Still, it's more than some expected. And with talk of Viserys Targaryen in Essos, we'll need every shred of unity we can muster. For all we know, the Golden Company might be readying ships this very moment." Robert nodded, distant. "If the day comes that Targaryens set foot on Westerosi soil again, We shall see whether our realm truly stands on new ground, or collapses into old loyalties and hatreds. They left Riverrun shortly after, traveling back to the stormlands with a modest escort. The roads were muddy from autumn rains, and the evenings grew cold. At each river crossing, they saw travelers heading in all directions, carrying news of the newly signed Second Compact. Some seemed hopeful, believing that this time, the realm might truly stand together. Others were cynical, scoffing that powerful lords would never truly submit to an agreement. Robert rode in silence for much of the journey, occasionally remarking on the farmland or the weather, but seldom on the council's outcome. Ned ventured gently. "Is something about the agreement weighing on you more than usual?" Robert exhaled a sigh. "I'm just tired, Ned. Tired of forging pacts and alliances. I once believed smashing Rhaegar Targaryen on the Trident would fix everything. Then it was slaying the Mad King that would fix it. Then burning the Iron Throne. Yet still, the realm writhes with problems. I see no end to it." Ned placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Life rarely grants the neat ending of a battlefield victory. But think how much worse it would be if we'd simply replaced the Targaryens with another tyrant. At least now, men have a chance to govern themselves, if they can find the will to do it well." Robert offered a wry smile. "Aye, that's the hope. And if the day comes that Viserys tries to reclaim the monarchy, I'll stand with hammer in hand once more, to show him why that old world is gone." They pressed on, arriving at Storm's End after a week of hard riding. The castle's presence felt like a bulwark against the chaos outside. The old walls had stood against many assaults. Its thick ramparts were a comfort. Robert resumed his daily tasks, reading reports, meeting local lords, ensuring the harvest was brought in, dispatching funds for King's Landing's watch. Ned, after a few days, prepared to ride north, for he missed his family and wanted to see Winterfell before the snows grew too deep. On the morning of Ned's departure, the two men stood in Storm's End's courtyard, the wind tugging at their cloaks. "Farewell, my friend," Ned said. "If the snows aren't too harsh, I may come south again in the spring. The Council of Wardens meets in 6 months. Does it not?" Robert nodded. "We'll see how many actually attend. Remember to watch for any sign of Targaryen infiltration in White Harbor or along the Bight. If you catch wind of anything, send a raven." Ned clasped his forearm. "Of course. Take care of yourself. Don't let these burdens devour you." Robert chuckled, though the warmth didn't fully reach his eyes. "I'm too stubborn to be devoured." With that, Ned Stark and his riders departed, banners snapping in the breeze. Robert stood at the gates, watching them until they disappeared down the coastal road. A strange loneliness crept over him. He realized he had grown used to Ned's calming presence. Now, with his friend gone, the weight of leadership pressed down harder. Winter approached in the north, and in the south, the storms grew fiercer. Traders coming from Essos brought no definitive proof that Viserys had actually secured the Golden Company's allegiance, but the rumors grew stronger. Meanwhile, the Ironborn presence at sea remained menacing, though open war had not broken out. The lords of the Westerlands and the Riverlands continued their border tensions, but at least they had not erupted into full-scale battle. Tywin Lannister's formidable reputation kept some measure of fear alive, while Edmure Tully's youth and sincerity aimed for a precarious peace. Dorne simmered under Oberyn's restless energy, and the Tyrells charted shipping routes to maintain wealth. Thus, Westeros endured, perched on the edge of possibility. One misstep could tumble it into chaos, yet with each passing day, the new age quietly persisted. In King's Landing, the City Watch tried to enforce order, bolstered slightly by coin from Robert's coffers. Street preachers emerged, proclaiming that the destruction of the Iron Throne was an omen from the gods, a call for a new way of life. Criminals lurked in the labyrinthine alleys, but a fragile equilibrium took hold. By the New Year's turn, the city's small folk were better fed, though they still longed for a strong hand to guide them. Whispers of Targaryen restoration circulated in the taverns, while sly men promised that a dragon prince would soon cross the narrow sea. But no sails bearing the dragon sigil appeared on Blackwater Bay. Month by month, the realm inched forward. The stormlands prepared to host the next Warden's Council, as the newly minted arrangement dictated. In Old Town, the Citadel recorded each event with meticulous detail, uncertain how future generations might judge this era. An age after monarchy, an age of uneasy confederation. Maesters debated the viability of the compact, with some praising the spirit of independence and others lamenting the lack of a single unifying authority. Robert Baratheon, for his part, spent his days dealing with a parade of local disputes, from boundary lines to inheritance feuds. At times, it felt trivial compared to the grand stage he had once occupied, yet it was the bedrock of governance. He also drilled his men, forging a modest but ready force he called the Storm Guard, loyal to the Baratheons, prepared to march if needed. Some nights, he dined with lesser lords, trading stories of the rebellion with a hint of nostalgia. Wine helped him sleep, though he never let it consume him as once it had threatened to do. The memory of the molten throne was an anchor, keeping him from drifting into complacency. As winter's chill settled over the northern half of Westeros, ravens arrived at Storm's End bearing grim tidings from the wall. Though few southerners paid attention, the Night's Watch complained of dwindling supplies and an uptick in sightings of strange things beyond the ice. Robert read the letters but could make little sense of them. He had no authority over the entire realm's resources, no direct means to command the other lords to send aid. He forwarded the pleas to the Warden's Council, suspecting little would be done. What threat could come from a frozen wasteland? Was the common attitude. But Ned Stark's warnings haunted him. Winter is coming, Ned always said, a stark truism that Robert once found quaint. Now he was not so sure. While the nights grew long in the north, the seas remained restless in the south. Ironborn longships skirmished with Tyroshi corsairs near the Stepstones. The Tyrells patrolled the Mander and the Arbor, capturing a few pirate vessels. Victarion Greyjoy demanded the return of Ironborn sailors who had been taken prisoner. The Warden's Council tried to mediate through letters, but results were limited. Balon Greyjoy's silence stretched ominously. Late in the winter, a battered merchant cog limped into Storm's End's harbor, reporting sightings of a large fleet assembling near the Basilisk Isles. Pirates or sellswords, the crew could not say. Robert had no ships to send so far afield, but he dispatched ravens to every realm. The idea that a foreign threat could mass an invasion fleet was alarming, whether it was the Golden Company or not. Mace Tyrell responded with a dismissive letter, claiming it was likely just a gathering of pirates. Tywin Lannister sent no direct reply, but a rumor emerged that the Westerlands had quietly begun stockpiling iron for forging more weapons. Dorn remained cryptic, Doran Martell writing only that Dorne's coasts were vigilantly watched. Jon Arryn expressed concern and pledged to speak with Braavosi bankers about funding a standing naval force, but that raised the old debate about who would command such a force. As the year turned, the day came for the Warden's Council to convene again, this time at Storm's End. Delegates began arriving under cold rain. Robert felt no joy at hosting them. He knew it meant another round of arguments. But he went through the motions, ordering chambers prepared, storerooms stocked with provisions, the great hall made fit for a gathering. Ned Stark came south once more, though his stay had to be brief. The Vale sent Jon Arryn's chosen representative, as the Hand himself was ill. Dorne sent Oberyn again. Tywin Lannister did not come in person. He sent Tyrion Lannister as his envoy, which caused a stir. The Tyrells, the Tullys, and a Greyjoy representative also arrived. Once again, a swirl of politicking consumed the castle's corridors. In a smaller meeting before the formal council, Robert found himself speaking with Tyrion Lannister. The dwarf was witty and sharp-tongued, a man whose intellect Robert had rarely encountered. Over cups of mulled wine, Tyrion examined Robert with inquisitive eyes. "So, my lord, do you still think destroying the Iron Throne was the best course? We find ourselves in no small measure of chaos." Robert studied him, wondering if this was a trick question. "Yes, I'd do it again," he replied, voice firm. "I know your father disapproved, but I have no regrets." Tyrion's mouth quirked. "As you say, I suppose it's too late to unmake that decision. Still, One wonders if a gentler transition might have preserved some stability. "You think me a fool?" Robert growled, bristling at the suggestion. "Oh, I think you a great many things," Tyrion replied candidly. "But that's not necessarily one of them. Boldness and folly sometimes dance hand in hand. If you'll pardon the observation, you destroyed a symbol that held the realm together, and now you're forced to create a new system from scratch. But perhaps that was always the cost of freedom." Robert mulled the words, caught between annoyance and grudging respect. Well, if men like your father had reigned in the worst impulses of the monarchy, maybe we wouldn't be here." Tyrion laughed softly. "Touché. My father is a man who wields power like a blacksmith wields a hammer. Not so different from you in a sense, though your notion of power is less singular." Their conversation was cut short by a summons to the hall. The new council commenced with the usual arguments over shipping lanes, border feuds, and how to pay for a readiness force against the rumored threat of invasion. Oberyn clashed with the Tully and Tyrell delegates over compensation claims, while the Greyjoy envoy sneered at talk of a unified navy. Tyrion spoke with diplomatic flair, evading direct commitments while offering small concessions to avoid Lannister entanglements. Ned Stark tried to mediate, but it was like herding cats. In the end, the council produced no dramatic shift. They reaffirmed the Second Compact, made minor amendments about trade, and parted with more tension than they had arrived with. Yet even these half measures ensured that no single kingdom broke away in outright hostility. In the months after, the Greyjoy raids lessened, if only slightly. The Riverlands and the Westerlands maintained a strained peace. The Targaryen threat remained intangible, with no sign of an actual landing. Life went on: harvests, births, marriages, funerals, while the High Lords wrangled over matters of commerce and war. The years that followed tested Westeros's fragile confederation in 100 subtle ways. A savage outbreak of disease in Dorne forced quarantine measures in the southwestern ports, prompting the Tyrells to close certain trade routes and angering Oberyn. The Lannisters expanded their gold mining operations, prompting envy and suspicion among their neighbors. Balon Greyjoy, still styling himself a king, staged a fresh wave of reavings against coastal villages in the north, which ironically forced Ned Stark to consider building a small northern fleet. The Tullys contended with roving brigands along the Trident. Even King's Landing, that battered old city, found a sort of uneasy stability with a makeshift council of local lords and merchants, though corruption remained rife. Through it all, Robert Baratheon strove to keep the compact alive. Whenever war threatened, he reminded the lords that a greater danger might come from beyond the narrow sea, that Viserys Targaryen and his supporters would seize any chance to divide and conquer. Some listened, some dismissed him, but the mere possibility of a Targaryen return served as a unifying bogeyman. No realm wished to stand alone if the Golden Company arrived in force, and so they maintained a precarious unity, not out of love, but out of mutual caution. Robert took no pleasure in such unity, but it was better than nothing. As a decade slipped by, 10 years since the day the Iron Throne melted, Westeros was neither entirely at peace nor drowned in war. The North remained watchful for the cold creeping from beyond the wall. The Vale looked inward as Lord Robert Arryn grew into a sickly boy, uncertain to survive adulthood. The Westerlands thrived economically, spurring envy. The Reach prospered with bountiful harvests, but nursed grudges against the Iron Islands. Dorne stood aloof, harboring old wounds, while the Riverlands functioned as a crossroads of trade and minor conflicts. The Stormlands, under Robert's stewardship, found a measure of resilience. And overhead, gulls still wheeled over the waters near King's Landing, as if waiting for the next drama to unfold. In every tavern and keep, the small folk gossiped about which realm might next break the compact, whether the Targaryens would come roaring back, or if some new figure might attempt to crown themselves. Yet, year after year, no single king arose, and the confederation endured. It became part of the fabric of Westeros, though many still doubted it would last. Maesters debated whether Robert's revolutionary act had ensured a freer realm or merely postponed the next great war. One crisp morning, Robert walked along the walls of Storm's End and gazed at the churning sea. His hair was streaked with gray now, his beard shot with silver, yet his shoulders remained broad. Lines of care etched his face, but something like peace had begun to temper his once constant fury. He thought of Lyanna Stark, the rebellion, the melted throne, and all that followed. Perhaps the cost had been worth it. In this new order, lords were forced to negotiate or risk fighting a coalition. Small folk in most regions went about their lives without an all-powerful king's hand demanding levies or a mad king threatening to burn cities. Yes, there were tensions and raids and feuds. Westeros was not a place of easy harmony. But a century of Targaryen rule had hardly been peaceful either, plagued with its own rebellions and tyrants. A gull cried overhead, and Robert turned, resting his hands on the crenellations. Far across the sea, he imagined a Targaryen boy grown to a man, dreaming of conquest. If Viserys truly intended to press his claim, he had taken an awfully long time to do it. Perhaps by now, he realized that a realm of 7 proud kingdoms was not so easily reclaimed. Or perhaps he still plotted in the shadows, biding his time until an opportunity arose. Robert had learned patience in these last 10 years, an irony, for once he had been as hot-blooded as they came. If Viserys arrived tomorrow, Robert would be ready, and not alone. That was the crucial difference. The entire realm had tasted independence. They would not surrender it meekly. He closed his eyes, recalling the blaze that devoured the Iron Throne. In that searing instant, he had shattered the symbol of absolute monarchy. He had also shattered the illusions that a single man could shepherd all the varied folk of Westeros without turning tyrant. The choice to break the throne had spawned years of chaos and negotiation, new pacts and new grudges. But it had also sown seeds of possibility. There was no more King of the Undulls and the Rhoynar and the First Men. No single seat to overshadow them all. If they found themselves forced to unite, it would be by consensus, not fear. If that consensus was fragile, at least it was theirs. Men might curse his name for the changes he wrought, but so long as the realm could find its footing without a tyrant on a spiked chair, he would accept their curses. Storm's end stands, he muttered to himself, the wind tossing his hair. And so does Westeros for now. Footsteps approached. A stormlands knight bowed. My lord, another raven from the Night's Watch. They beg for aid again. They speak of more raids by wildlings, though they mention stranger things as well. Robert sighed, opening his eyes. A realm of troubles. Well, let us see if we can muster some help. He turned from the sea, heading inside. The clang of armor and the murmur of servants followed. Beyond these walls, a fractured continent carried on with its dance. No throne binding them, no absolute power to crush or unify them. Only the precarious bonds they had forged themselves. And in that precariousness lay a strange kind of freedom, the fruit of Robert Baratheon's greatest and most controversial act. He walked into the castle, ready to face the letters awaiting him. Wars might loom, or storms might rage, but he would endure. The story of Westeros was no longer the story of kings, but the story of many lords and many peoples, each shaping their own destiny in the shadow of a melted throne. In that swirl of ambition and hope and fear, Robert found a flicker of resolve. He had not broken the realm, he had simply broken its chains. If men chose to forge new ones, that was on their conscience, not his. With one final look at the distant horizon, he squared his broad shoulders and strode forward, the memory of fire in his heart and the faint echo of a dream, of a land no longer bent by a single will, guiding his steps into the day's uncertain light.